The argument that Neanderthals were a separate species was never really a genetic argument at all, but a morphology argument. An argument built from skull profiles, brow ridges, pelvis fragments, and the old habit of looking at bones and drawing hard borders where biology itself kept making blurred ones. That is the uncomfortable place where this debate begins, because the more we learn about Neanderthals, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the clean schoolbook division. But why is this important? The standard model says modern humans, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, were something else. And when the two finally met, a little bit of Neanderthal DNA entered our lineage before Neanderthals vanished forever. It sounds tidy, it sounds scientific. It sounds like a story with a beginning, a migration, a replacement, and an ending. It is a story that has been repeated for decades until it has become what many refer to as a dogma. The debate about Neanderthal morphology is not just an old technical argument. It is the center of the human origins debate today. The case for separating Neanderthals rests on physical traits such as skull shape, pelvis width, ear bone form, brow ridges, mid-facial projection, teeth, rib cage, and chin development. But those are precisely the kinds of traits that vary across ancient human populations, living human populations, climate zones, sex, age, body size, and small fossil samples. Paleoanthropologists who still want to classify Neanderthals as separate even admit that the genetic argument doesn't work, so they have fallen back on the old morphology argument. Skeletal morphology is one of the key pillars of the human origins debate. If we were looking at wolves, coyotes, dogs, jackals, or bears, we would instinctively understand that hybridization complicates taxonomy. But with humans, the emotional pressure is different. The moment Neanderthals are allowed to be human, the model of human origins changes. If Neanderthals were not truly a separate species in the strict biological sense, then modern humans cannot be treated as a neat African replacement species that arrived fully formed and merely absorbed a little archaic residue along the way. Instead, modern humans becomes a broader lineage, with regional branches, deep structure, repeated contact, and populations that were different, yes, but not different in the clean, absolute way the old model requires. The standard morphological argument begins with the skull. Neanderthals, we are told, had a long, low cranial vault, a strong double-arched brow ridge, a protruding mid-face, large front teeth, little or no chin, and often an occipital bun at the back of the skull. Modern humans, by contrast, are supposed to have a high, rounded brain case, a vertical forehead, a small brow ridge, a flat face tucked under the brain case, and a clear, projecting chin. On paper, this sounds powerful. Put a classic Neanderthal skull beside a recent European skull, and the difference looks obvious. But that comparison is already rigged, because it compares late Pleistocene people who lived under Ice Age selection, often with large bodies, heavy jaws, and high physical stress, to recent humans shaped by Holocene diets, reduced chewing loads, smaller faces, softer foods, and thousands of years of population change. It is not a neutral comparison between two equivalent samples, it is a comparison across time, ecology, and lifestyle, and then the result is treated as if it proves a species boundary. The famous Neanderthal large nose is one of the weakest arguments for separating them from Homo sapiens, because nose size and nasal projection vary enormously within living humans and are strongly shaped by climate, breathing demands, facial architecture, and ancestry. A large nose is not a primitive trait, and it is not a species marker. It is simply one possible human adaptation, especially in populations living in cold, dry, or physically demanding environments where warming and humidifying air may have mattered. When Neanderthal noses are treated as evidence that they were fundamentally different from us, the argument starts to sound less like biology and more like old racial typology, where facial features were exaggerated into categories of human worth. The honest interpretation is simpler. Neanderthals had distinctive faces, but a large nose does not make a human less human. The real test is not Neanderthal versus a modern European. The real test is Neanderthal versus the range of ancient modern humans and other middle Pleistocene humans. Once that comparison is made, the clean border begins to dissolve. Early modern humans' fossils from Africa and the Levant are not delicate, chin-forward, flat-faced people in the modern textbook sense. Many are robust. Many have strong brow ridges. Many have long skulls. Many have faces that project more than recent humans. Some have mosaic combinations that do not sit comfortably in any simple category. The air-toe skull from Ethiopia, for example, is usually classified as Homo sapiens idaltu, yet it is not a soft-faced modern human in the living sense. It is massive, powerful, thick-boned and archaic-looking by recent standards. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, often placed near the base of the modern human lineage, shows a modern-looking face combined with a long, low brain case, meaning that even within early modern humans, the so-called globular skull was not fully fixed. The chin is one of the most overused symbols in this debate. A projecting chin is often treated as a badge of true modern humans, while the weak or absent chin of Neanderthals is treated as evidence of separation. But the chin is not a magical species marker. It is part of a complex mandibular architecture affected by jaw size, dental reduction, facial projection, chewing mechanics, growth pattern, and population history. Living humans vary in chin projection. Some have prominent chins, some have weak chins, some have receding lower faces, and some have faces where the chin is not the clean cartoon triangle used in diagrams. No serious observer would classify living humans with weaker chins as less human, less sapiens, or members of another species. Yet when Neanderthals show a different mandibular profile, the feature is elevated into a taxonomic wall. The inconsistency is obvious. A trait that is variable and non-essential in living humans becomes decisive only when the ancient European population is being judged. The brow ridge creates the same illusion. Neanderthal brow ridges were often large, continuous, and double-arched, and this is treated as a dramatic separation from modern humans. But heavy brow ridges are not exclusive to Neanderthals, and reduced brow ridges are not universal in modern humans. Brow size responds to facial architecture, cranial shape, mechanical loading and developmental pattern. Hairtoe has heavy brow ridges. Kabwe has enormous brow ridges. Many Middle Pleistocene humans have powerful supraorbital structures. Even among recent humans, brow development varies by sex, ancestry, individual growth, and craniofacial robusticity. The problem is not that Neanderthal brow ridges are imaginary, they are real. The problem is that real difference is being inflated into species-level separation, while comparable variation elsewhere in Homo is treated as population-level diversity or evolutionary grade. A large brow ridge cannot be a species-defining feature in one population and merely a robust trait in another, unless the conclusion has already been chosen. The brain case argument is more subtle because Neanderthal skulls do have a distinctive outer shape. They tend to be long and low, while recent humans tend to have a higher, more globular cranial vault. This difference matters, but it does not automatically prove separate species. Brain case shape is not the same as mental capacity, nor is the outer contour of the skull identical to the functional organization of the brain inside it. Neanderthal cranial capacity was often as large as, and sometimes larger than, that of recent humans. Their brains were not small. Their endocranial shape differs in some ways, but variation in brain shape exists within modern humans as well, and early modern humans did not all possess the fully rounded cranial form that later became common. If the earliest accepted modern human fossils can have long, low vaults, then a long, low vault cannot by itself exclude Neanderthals from a broader sapiens-grade humanity. It may indicate regional evolution, developmental difference or adaptation, but that is not the same thing as biological separation at the species level. The occipital bun is another feature that sounds more decisive than it is. Neanderthals often had a projecting rear skull shape, and this is treated as one of their classic markers. But posterior cranial projection is not some alien structure. It is an exaggerated version of variation seen across archaic humans and in weaker form among some recent human populations. The same is true of skull thickness, vault elongation, and facial projection.
The Neanderthals had a long and successful evolutionary history. They evolved and survived in Europe over a period of at least 200,000 years. But in that time, they also developed their own special features, and these occurred through the skeleton, but in particular, they concentrated in the face. The face is dominated by the nose, a very large and projecting nose, and the whole middle of the face is pulled forwards, taking with it the teeth as well. And for me, this in particular marks them off as something different, probably a different species from us.
Once again, the issue is not whether Neanderthals had recognizable tendencies. They clearly did. The issue is whether those tendencies justify turning a regional Pleistocene human population into a separate species, especially when the genetic evidence says that these people could and did merge with other humans repeatedly. Morphology can diagnose ancestry, but diagnosis is not the same as species separation. A skull can tell us where a population came from without proving that it belonged to a different biological kind. The pelvis and rib cage argument is even more fragile because the fossil record is painfully incomplete. Neanderthals are often described as having a wide pelvis, a broad trunk, and a deep rib cage, while modern humans are described as narrower, more lightly built, and more efficient for long-distance running in warmer environments. But this contrast has always been too neat. Living humans vary dramatically in body breadth, pelvic form, torso shape, limb proportions, and skeletal robusticity. Cold-adapted populations tend to differ from tropical populations in body proportions, but those differences do not create species boundaries. Sex differences also matter, individual variation matters, developmental history matters, nutrition and mechanical loading matter, and with Neanderthals, the sample is limited enough that every new specimen can shift the picture. Ahmud, for example, was tall compared with the classic stereotype, and not every Neanderthal fits the short, barrel-chested caricature. Some were extremely robust, some were less so. Some early Homo sapiens were also robust in ways that would surprise anyone raised on the idea that modern humans were always slender African runners. If we are willing to recognize variation inside the sapiens lineage, we cannot suddenly deny that same principle when examining Neanderthals. The ribcage story is especially revealing because it touches the deeper myth behind the taxonomy. The old contrast imagines sapiens as a tropical, long-legged, narrow-bodied species born on open African savannas, while Neanderthals are imagined as cold-adapted Europeans with wide bodies and heavy limbs. But the fossil record has been steadily complicating this picture. Early African and Eurasian humans were not all built like modern endurance runners. Some had broad trunks, powerful bones, and large bodies. Even reconstructions of earlier humans, including famous African specimens like Turkana boy, have become more complicated as researchers revisit assumptions about torso shape, pelvis form, and locomotor adaptation. The story of a narrow, modern African body plan replacing a stocky, archaic European body plan is too simple. Pleistocene humans lived in many environments, and body form was not a passport stamp proving species identity. A broad pelvis or wide rib cage may tell us about climate, birth mechanics, locomotion, body mass, or ancestry, but it does not automatically mark the boundary between human and non-human. The ear bone argument may be the strangest because it sounds precise and scientific, but its meaning is often overstated. Neanderthals had distinctive middle and inner ear structures, and those differences can help specialists identify fossils. But a diagnostic anatomical difference is not automatically a species boundary. The crucial question is whether the difference reflects reproductive isolation, functional incompatibility, or deep biological separation. If ear structures differ slightly in shape, but do not imply a fundamentally different hearing system or a barrier to interbreeding, then they are useful for classification in a descriptive sense, not decisive proof of separate species. Many living human populations have measurable skeletal differences in cranial form, nasal form, dental traits, limb proportions, and pelvic metrics. Anthropologists can often estimate ancestry from bones, sometimes with impressive accuracy, but no one would argue that these diagnostic differences make living human populations separate species. That is the double standard. When variation is recent, we call it human diversity. When variation is ancient and Neanderthal, we call it species separation. This is where the historical sensitivity becomes unavoidable. The method being used against Neanderthals has an uncomfortable resemblance to older racial classification systems. A century ago, anthropologists measured skulls, noses, jaws, pelvises, and cranial indices, and used those measurements to rank or divide living humans into supposed biological types. Today, that old racial taxonomy is rightly rejected as a crude distortion of human variation. Yet when the subject is Neanderthals, a population that lived in Ice Age Europe and Western Eurasia, some of the same instincts return under more respectable language. Brow ridge, skull length, chin, pelvis, face, ear canal, tooth size. These traits are gathered into a profile, and then the profile is used to deny that Neanderthals were part of the same species-level humanity as us. The irony is difficult to miss. The same intellectual culture that insists all living humans are one species despite visible variation sometimes turns around and says that ancient humans who were genetically close, behaviorally complex and reproductively compatible must be placed outside Homo sapiens because their bones look different. That does not mean Neanderthals were identical to recent humans. They were not. A serious rebuttal does not need to pretend they were merely modern Europeans with heavy brows. Neanderthals had a recognizable pattern. Their skulls, teeth, faces, bodies and developmental trajectories often differ from recent humans. But difference is not the question. The question is rank. At what point does regional difference become species difference? That is not a simple anatomical fact. It is an interpretation. The out-of-Africa replacement model depends heavily on this asymmetry. Homo sapiens are treated as the true species, rooted in Africa, while Neanderthals are treated as a separate Eurasian species that contributed a little DNA after modern humans expanded. But if Neanderthals were part of the same species-level lineage, the geography changes. Homo sapiens no longer looks like a purely African species that later encountered unrelated Eurasian cousins. It looks more like a widespread metapopulation, with African, European and Asian branches evolving in partial separation, but not total isolation. The Levant is the thorn in the side of the standard out-of-Africa model. For more than 100,000 years, it seems to have held populations that do not fit comfortably into the replacement script. Skul and Kafse are usually called early modern humans. Tabun, Kebara and Amud are usually placed with Neanderthals. But geographically, these people lived close to one another, sometimes in the same broad region, using related Middle Paleolithic technologies, inhabiting similar caves and landscapes, and existing within shifting climatic windows that repeatedly opened and closed routes between Africa and Eurasia. The idea that one group was fully modern human and the other was a separate species becomes harder to sustain when the region looks less like a border between species and more like a contact zone within a broader human population system. If the Levant was a meeting place, a refuge and a mixing zone, then Neanderthals were not strangers at the gates of humanity. They were one of the regional expressions of it. The strongest counter-argument is that Neanderthals had a long, separate evolutionary history. Their distinctive traits were already visible by hundreds of thousands of years ago. And by 100,000 years ago, fossils assigned to Neanderthals and sapiens can often be distinguished. That is true in a descriptive sense, but separate history does not always equal separate species. Populations can diverge for long periods and still remain reproductively compatible. Subspecies can be deeply structured. Ring species, hybrid zones and porous boundaries are common in nature. Even if Neanderthals had been evolving regionally in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, the key question is whether that separation became complete enough to prevent gene flow and fertility. The answer appears to be no. Gene flow occurred. Descendants survived. The boundary was porous. That does not make Neanderthals just modern humans in a simplistic sense, but it does make the hard species label look more like a convention than a biological necessity. The morphology first position also ignores the fact that fossil classification has always been unstable. The same fossils are often reinterpreted across decades. One calls a specimen archaic sapiens, another calls it Homo heidelbergensis, another sees early Neanderthal traits, proving how subjective these boundaries can be. If morphology gave us clean species borders, these fossils would not keep shifting between categories. The problem is not that scientists are incompetent. The problem is that the fossils are genuinely mosaic. They preserve a world where evolution did not proceed through isolated boxes, but through regional populations with overlapping traits. Neanderthals are part of that world, not an exception to it. The comparison to living humans remains the most powerful moral and scientific test. Imagine an anthropologist from the future discovering a small sample of recent human skeletons from extreme environments. Arctic bodies with cold-adapted proportions, Andaman islanders with small stature, Sudanese peoples with long limbs, Australian Aboriginal skulls with robust cranial features, Patagonians shaped by cold and isolation, and later Holocene populations with reduced jaws and smaller faces. If that future anthropologist had no genetic context and a strong desire to split, he could create multiple species from recent humanity. He could use skull shape, limb proportions, pelvis form, tooth size, facial projection, and cranial robusticity. He would be wrong, but his measurements might be real. That is the danger. Real measurements can support false categories when variation is misunderstood. The Neanderthal debate forces us to ask whether taxonomy is describing biology or preserving a story. If Neanderthals are kept as a separate species, the out-of-Africa replacement model remains intact. Sapiens emerge in Africa, leave Africa, meet another species, absorb a little DNA and replace them. But if Neanderthals are classified as a branch of sapiens, or at least as a subspecies within a broader sapiens complex, then the story changes dramatically. Sapiens become older, wider and more structured. Europe and Western Eurasia are no longer occupied by a different kind of human, but by a regional branch of humanity. Africa remains crucial, but not as a sealed Garden of Eden producing the only true humans. The Levant and North Africa become central theatres of continuity and mixture. The human species becomes a braided river, not a single stream pouring out of one place, and the idea of Africa a sealed bubble implodes. This does not mean every claim of continuity is proven. It does not mean Neanderthals were identical to modern Europeans. It does not mean Africa becomes irrelevant, or that regional evolution should be turned into a new myth as rigid as the old one. The better argument is more careful and more dangerous. The evidence does not support the hard separation that the standard model requires. Neanderthals were different, but their difference looks increasingly like the difference between long-isolated, regionally adapted human populations, not the difference between humans and a separate biological species. Their morphology is distinctive, but not beyond the range of what deep-time human variation can produce. Their genes are close, their interbreeding was real, and their legacy survives not as a curiosity, but as part of the living human genome. So perhaps the question is not whether Neanderthals were human. That may be the wrong question, inherited from an old model that needed clean categories because it wanted a clean origin story. The better question is why we are so determined to draw the line exactly where the evidence becomes most blurred. A skull with a brow ridge, a pelvis with a wider flare, an ear bone with a different contour, a jaw with a weaker chin. These are not trivial details, but neither are they magic walls. They are traces of ancestry, adaptation, and time. And if those traces belong to people who could meet our ancestors, mate with them, leave children, shape our immune systems, and remain inside our genome tens of thousands of years later, then maybe Neanderthals were never a separate humanity after all. Maybe they were one of the old faces of the same human story, a branch that vanished in form but not entirely in blood, leaving behind the unsettling possibility that the boundary between modern and archaic was never a wall, but a mirror we have been afraid to look into too closely. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you and take care.